May 1963 cold case solved, arrest shocks community. That's the line that ripped through the states 6 decades later, but the story begins in silence. In the winter of 1963, on a narrow road rimmed with pines and frozen ditches, a young woman vanished without a scream, without a struggle anyone could hear. When she didn't come home, neighbors assumed what everyone assumed back then: a missed bus, a late ride, a harmless misunderstanding that would correct itself by morning. When they finally found her belongings, there was a detail that unsettled people who saw it, and then was quickly explained away. A single shoe, neatly placed. Not torn. Not scattered. Just there. It suggested order where there should have been chaos, calm where fear should have lived. Authorities said it meant nothing. No sign of violence. No sign of foul play. For years, that explanation held. The town accepted it because it needed to. Maine winters are long. People close ranks. And when the sheriff, trusted, respected, woven into the fabric of the community, said there was no crime, most people believed him. The case was filed, boxed, and quietly slid into the past. But time has a way of changing what evidence can say. Decades later, when the box was reopened, one overlooked detail, small enough to miss in 1963, began to speak. Technology gave it a voice. And when it did, it pointed somewhere no one expected. Toward someone everyone trusted. Toward a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight. This is the story of a disappearance that felt ordinary, a case that was closed too quickly, and a single detail that waited 60 years to tell the truth. The morning she disappeared began without urgency, without drama, without anything that would later explain why it mattered. In the quiet towns of rural Maine in 1963, days often unfolded the same way, stitched together by routine and weather. The cold had settled in early that winter, pressing against the windows before dawn, frosting the edges of everything it touched. Inside the house, the air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and wool. She moved through the kitchen in familiar motions, each one practiced enough that she didn't have to think about it. She dressed carefully as she always did when the roads were slick. A heavy coat. Gloves pulled tight. A scarf wrapped twice around her neck, the ends tucked in to keep the wind from biting at her skin. There was nothing rushed in her movements. No sense of unease. If there had been, someone would have remembered it. Instead, what people recalled later were the smallest, most ordinary things. The way she checked the clock twice before leaving, the way she paused at the door as if she'd forgotten something, then shook her head and stepped outside. The road was quiet when she started walking. Snow had been packed down by passing cars, leaving narrow paths along the edges where footprints gathered and froze. Pine trees stood thick on either side, their branches heavy and still, muting sound the way only winter can. Her breath rose in pale clouds, disappearing almost as soon as it formed. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then stopped. The world felt held in place. Neighbors saw her in passing. A nod. A wave. Nothing more. One man later said she smiled at him, a quick polite smile meant for someone you see every day but never really know. Another remembered the sound of her boots against the ice, steady and unhurried. These memories survived not because they were important at the time, but because they were the last pieces of normality anyone could cling to once she was gone. She had plans that day. Ordinary ones. Errands. A conversation she intended to finish later. Things that assume a future without needing to name it. There was no sense that she was walking toward the edge of her life, no sign that the routine she trusted was about to betray her. When she reached the stretch of road where the trees closed in tighter, the light thinned. The snow was deeper there, less disturbed. Her footprints would later be traced to that point, then become harder to follow, blurred by wind and passing time. But in that moment, she kept walking, one step after another, unaware that this was where the day would stop making sense. Hours passed. Afternoon settled in. The sky darkened earlier than expected, the way it always does in winter. At home, a light was left on. Dinner waited, cooling on the stove. Each minute that ticked by felt heavier than the last, though no one yet knew why. By nightfall, the absence could no longer be explained away. The routine had broken. And in that break, fear quietly took root, slow at first, then spreading, marking the end of a day that had begun like any other, and the beginning of a mystery that would last more than 60 years. The search began without coordination, without sirens, without the language of emergencies. It started the way disappearances often did in 1963, with neighbors walking familiar paths, calling her name into the trees, listening for an answer they expected to hear. The cold sharpened every sound. Footsteps crunched too loudly. Voices carried farther than intended. And when nothing answered back, the silence felt heavier than it should have. By mid-morning, more people joined in. Men with heavy coats and wool caps. Women who stayed near the road, scanning ditches and tree lines, afraid to look too closely but unable to look away. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, soft enough to blur yesterday's footprints without fully erasing them. The road looked clean. Too clean. Someone spotted the scarf first. It lay just off the shoulder, half buried in snow, the fabric stiff from frost. It was unmistakably hers. A few people recognized it immediately and stopped walking, as if the ground itself had given a warning. No one wanted to be the one to touch it. They stood there, hands in pockets, breath visible, staring at something that suddenly made the disappearance real. The shoe was found farther down. It sat upright near the edge of the trees, toes pointed inward, as if it had been set there deliberately. The laces were intact. The leather wasn't torn or scuffed the way it would have been if it had been dragged or thrown. There were no clear footprints around it, no sign of a struggle, no chaos frozen into the snow. Just a single shoe, alone and disturbingly neat. People whispered. Some stepped back. Others leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. A shoe wasn't supposed to be there by itself. It was an interruption, a question without an answer. And yet, in that moment, it also offered relief. A shoe meant she had been here. It meant there was something to find. When the sheriff arrived, he took in the scene quickly. He crouched near the shoe, careful not to disturb the snow more than necessary, and examined it with the practiced calm of someone used to being watched. He asked a few questions. Where had it been found? Who touched it? How long had it been there? The answers were uncertain, overlapping, imprecise. There were no signs that matched the town's idea of violence. No blood. No torn clothing scattered through the brush. No broken branches or churned up snow. What there was instead was order, and order can be misleading. It can suggest intention where there was panic, or innocence where there was something else entirely. The sheriff made a decision that day, quietly and without ceremony. He told the searchers what he believed they were seeing. Accidents happened. People slipped. People wandered off roads in the cold and became disoriented. A shoe could come off without meaning anything more than that. The scarf and the shoe were collected, logged, and placed into evidence bags. The search continued, but its urgency softened, reshaped by the assumption that whatever had happened did not involve another person. By the time the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the snow, the discovery had already been explained away. What no one could explain, what no one tried to, was why the shoe looked placed, not lost. Or why that detail, unsettling as it was, would follow the case into the future, waiting decades for someone to look at it differently. The official conclusion settled in almost as quietly as the snow itself. Within days, the language around the disappearance began to change. It moved away from questions and toward assumptions, away from uncertainty and into something that sounded like closure. There was no evidence of violence, the sheriff said. No indication that another person had been involved. What happened was tragic, but not criminal. In 1963, those words carried weight. Rural departments worked with limited resources and even more limited tolerance for open-ended mysteries. A case without a clear suspect was a case that drained time, money, and morale. And this one, on its surface, offered an explanation that required none of that. A woman alone on a winter road. Cold. Confusion. It was a story people already understood. The search continued for a short while, but its purpose had shifted. Teams walked farther into the woods, scanning for a body rather than a perpetrator. The tone was quieter, methodical. The urgency that had driven neighbors into the cold during the first hours slowly gave way to resignation. Each day that passed without a discovery made the conclusion feel more certain. Inside the sheriff's office, the case file began to take shape. Notes were brief. Witness statements were summarized rather than recorded word for word. Timelines were rounded off, late morning, early afternoon, instead of pinned down to exact minutes. The scarf and the shoe were listed, described, and then, in effect, neutralized by interpretation. They were not treated as questions. They were treated as confirmations of an already accepted story. There was pressure, though no one called it that. Town leaders didn't want panic. Parents didn't want to imagine danger lurking along roads their children walked every day. And the sheriff, who had lived among these people his entire life, understood that better than anyone. His job was not just to investigate, but to reassure. When he spoke to the family, he did so gently. He explained the absence of evidence. He used careful language. He promised that if anything changed, they would be the first to know. But he also framed the disappearance as something that had already reached its end, even if the ending itself had not yet been found. As weeks passed, the phrase, "no foul play," hardened into fact. It appeared in reports. It echoed in conversations. It gave people permission to stop looking over their shoulders. And with each repetition, it narrowed the possibilities, quietly excluding ideas that didn't fit. What remained unexamined were the things that didn't belong in that narrative: the orderliness of the shoe, the lack of disturbance, the absence of clear footprints beyond a certain point. These details weren't ignored entirely. They were acknowledged, then smoothed over, explained away as quirks of weather and chance. By spring, the snow melted. The road returned to mud and gravel. The woods gave up nothing. The search was officially suspended, though no announcement marked the moment. It simply faded, leaving behind a conclusion that felt solid enough to stand on, even if it had never truly been tested. The case was not closed in name. But in practice, it was already being laid to rest. In a town like this, trust wasn't something you earned once. It was something you accumulated over years, through familiarity, through presence, through being there when people needed you. The sheriff had done all of that. He wasn't just the man who wore the badge. He was the man who knew everyone's name, who waved from his truck as he passed, who had been invited into homes during moments of crisis and celebration alike. He had been in his position long enough that people stopped seeing the uniform first. They saw the person beneath it, the neighbor, the helper, the steady voice when something went wrong. So when he spoke about the disappearance, his certainty felt reassuring. If he wasn't worried, why should anyone else be? He visited the family often in those first weeks. Sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. He sat at their kitchen table and listened as they asked the same questions again and again, hoping the answers might change. He told them what he believed to be true, that there were no signs of an attack, that no one had seen anything suspicious, that the evidence pointed toward an accident or a voluntary disappearance brought on by confusion and cold. What he did not say mattered just as much. He did not mention doubts. He did not linger on inconsistencies. He did not explain why certain avenues of inquiry were never pursued. To the family, his calm felt like competence. To the town, it felt like leadership. Behind the scenes, the case file reflected that confidence. Evidence was cataloged, but not revisited. Witness lists were finalized early, based largely on who had come forward on their own. Potential leads that didn't align with the prevailing narrative were noted briefly, then set aside. There was no malice written into the paperwork, only an assumption that the broad shape of the story was already known. Years later, when those records would be reviewed with fresh eyes, the gaps would stand out. Interviews reduced to a few lines. Times recorded as approximations. Decisions made without explanation. But in 1963, none of that seemed unusual. This was how cases were handled when there was nothing, or so it appeared, to chase. The sheriff's influence extended beyond the paperwork. His words shaped memory. Over time, people adjusted their recollections to fit what they had been told. A moment that once felt strange became less so. A detail that didn't make sense was forgotten altogether. When authority speaks with confidence, uncertainty tends to retreat. As months turned into years, the sheriff stopped visiting the family as often. There were no new developments to share. The case, though never formally closed, had slipped into the background of his duties. Other crimes demanded attention. Other crises arrived. The disappearance became part of the town's past, anchored to a single explanation because that explanation had come from someone everyone trusted. For a long time, no one had a reason or the courage to question it. In small towns, truth does not disappear all at once. It fades. It softens. It becomes manageable. Time does what it always does in places where people know one another's names and histories overlap like tree roots beneath the soil. It rounds off sharp edges. It turns fear into memory, and memory into something almost polite. The disappearance, once sharp and terrifying, gradually lost its immediacy. At first, it was all anyone talked about. Conversations paused when someone entered the room. Doors were locked a little earlier at night. Parents walked their children farther down the road than usual, watching the tree line as if it might move. But fear, when left unanswered, eventually exhausts itself. New winters came and went. Snow fell and melted again. The road where she vanished changed with the seasons, white and silent in winter, muddy in spring, dusty and forgettable in summer. Each passing year layered new tire tracks over the old ones, burying history beneath routine. What had once been the center of attention became just another stretch of pavement, driven without thought, crossed without pause. Children who had heard their parents whisper about the disappearance at the dinner table grew older. At first, they asked questions. Then fewer. Then none at all. The story became fragmented, passed down in pieces that no longer quite fit together. A woman. A winter. A shoe. Something sad. Something unresolved. Eventually, even those fragments lost their urgency, settling into the background noise of town lore. Inside the sheriff's office, the case file moved quietly, without ceremony. From a desk drawer, where it had once been pulled out daily, to a filing cabinet, where it sat among other unresolved matters. Later, to a storage room, its importance diminished by distance alone. Each relocation pushed it farther from memory, farther from scrutiny. The cardboard box that held the evidence was labeled, sealed, and stacked among dozens of others. All of them belonged to moments that had once felt urgent, moments that had demanded answers, explanations, accountability. Now they were simply objects, files, boxes, weight without presence. Inside that box, the shoe remained, the scarf too. They were preserved not because anyone believed they would matter again, but because procedure required it. Evidence, once collected, was rarely destroyed. Not out of reverence, but out of convenience. It was easier to keep something than to justify throwing it away. Easier to stack a box than to confront what it represented. And so those objects stayed. The shoe, still shaped to a foot, no longer there. The scarf, folded stiff with age. They waited in darkness, untouched, unexamined, sealed away in a silence so complete it felt permanent. They were frozen in time, holding details no one had yet learned how to hear. In the town itself, the story transformed. It became simpler, cleaner, easier to live with. The uncomfortable questions faded first. No one asked anymore how a person could vanish from such a familiar place. No one wondered why certain details didn't align. Instead, explanations became automatic, repeated until they hardened into certainty. She must have slipped. She must have wandered. She must have gotten turned around in the cold. Each version removed a little more responsibility from everyone else. From the town. From the system. From the people who had been trusted to look closer and didn't. People spoke about it the way they spoke about bad weather or old accidents, with a tone that suggested inevitability. Something unfortunate. Something unavoidable. Something that belonged to the past and should remain there. The sheriff retired. Another took his place. Then another. With each transition, the disappearance slipped further away from context. Each new officer inherited a version of the story already simplified by time. They knew it only as a line in an index. A name. A date. A brief notation beside it. No foul play suspected. That phrase carried authority. It shut doors quietly. There was no reason to reopen the case. No pressure. No complaints that traveled far enough up the chain to force a second look. The absence of noise became its own confirmation that nothing remained to be found. For the family, forgetting was never an option. They marked time differently than everyone else. Not by seasons, but by absences. By birthdays that came and went without her. By holidays that felt permanently altered, like a chair pulled away from the table and never replaced. While the town moved forward, they remained anchored to a moment that refused to pass. They asked for updates less frequently as the years went on. Not because they had given up, but because they had learned what the answers would be. Nothing new. Nothing to report. No developments. The silence became its own kind of response. A message delivered without words. As years turned into decades, even the physical details of the case began to blur. The exact location where the shoe had been found became uncertain. Witnesses aged. Some passed away. Others moved, carrying their memories with them, reshaping them through retelling and distance. What remained was not clarity, but resignation. A sense that whatever had happened was unknowable now. Too old to disturb. Too settled to challenge. The past had hardened into something immovable, protected by time and habit rather than truth. The case was never officially closed. But it lived in the space reserved for things that belonged to another era, before DNA databases, before digital reconstruction, before the expectation that every mystery could eventually be answered. It was a relic of a time when conclusions were drawn quickly and rarely revisited. And there it stayed. Forgotten by everyone except the people who never stopped waiting. And the evidence? The evidence endured quietly, holding on to details no one yet knew how to hear. The file was reopened not because of a breakthrough, not because of a confession or a tip or a sudden revelation, but because of a policy change. In the early decades of the 21st century, law enforcement agencies across the country began reassessing unsolved cases from the past. Advances in forensic technology had reshaped what was possible, and with that came a growing belief that time did not have to mean defeat. Old evidence, once considered inert, was being given a second life. In Maine, a small cold case unit was tasked with cataloging files that had not been touched in decades. It was quiet work, methodical, often disappointing. Most boxes were thin. Some contained little more than names and dates, the paper inside yellowed and brittle. When investigators pulled the 1963 disappearance from storage, they expected much the same. At first glance, it confirmed their assumptions. Brief reports. Minimal follow-up. A conclusion reached early and never challenged. Nothing that suggested complexity. Nothing that demanded attention. But something about it lingered. Not what was there, but what wasn't. The file lacked depth, context, justification. Decisions appeared final without explanation. Evidence existed, but without analysis. The case had been shaped by certainty rather than inquiry. And that was enough to justify a second look. Because sometimes, the most dangerous cases are not the ones filled with unanswered questions, but the ones that stopped asking them too soon. But something about it stood out. Cold case investigators see thousands of old files. Most follow a familiar pattern: yellowed paper, faded typewriter ink, brief summaries written by hands long retired or gone. The past often announces itself loudly through what it lacks: missing evidence, lost reports, destroyed records. But this file was different. Its silence felt deliberate. The evidence log was unusually sparse for a case involving a missing person. There were items listed, yes, but they were listed without explanation. No context. No analysis. No reasoning. Descriptions were reduced to the bare minimum, stripped of curiosity. Decisions appeared final without any indication of how they had been reached. It wasn't sloppy, it was neat. Too neat. And that was what unsettled the investigators most. It wasn't what was there that drew their attention. It was what wasn't. There were no margins filled with questions. No notes suggesting uncertainty. No recorded debates about alternative possibilities. The case had not evolved, it had been decided. And once decided, it had been preserved in a form that discouraged re-examination. When the box was opened for the first time in years, the objects inside felt almost out of place, as if they belonged to a different story than the paperwork describing them. The scarf still held its shape, stiff but intact, fibers preserved by cold and time. The shoe, though aged, remained remarkably whole. The leather was rigid now, creased by decades of stillness, but the laces were threaded the same way they had been that winter morning. It looked cared for. One of the investigators lifted it carefully, turning it over in their hands. They weren't searching for answers yet, only observing. The interior lining caught their attention immediately. The wear pattern told a story no report ever mentioned. The shoe hadn't been ripped away or torn loose. It had been removed deliberately. That detail alone didn't mean anything definitive. But the fact that it had never been documented meant something else entirely. These observations weren't conclusions. They were questions. And that alone set this review apart from the original investigation. Technology had changed what evidence could offer. In 1963, forensic science had limits that shaped not just investigations, but expectations. DNA testing didn't exist. Trace biological material was meaningless. Photographs captured moments but not detail. Timelines were reconstructed through memory alone. Now, all of that had changed. DNA testing required only microscopic amounts of material. Skin cells invisible to the naked eye could now tell stories with astonishing precision. Digital databases could compare profiles across jurisdictions in minutes. Photographs once dismissed as unusable could be stabilized, sharpened, and re-examined. What had once been noise could now become signal. The cold case unit decided to digitize everything. Reports were scanned and cataloged. Old photographs were cleaned, enlarged, and corrected for distortion. Timelines were rebuilt from the ground up using archived weather data, transit schedules, and modern mapping software. As the past took shape in sharper detail, small inconsistencies began to surface. Why had the search radius been so limited? Why had certain witnesses been interviewed only once? Why had the shoe, clearly the most unusual element of the scene, been treated as incidental rather than central? Individually, these questions proved nothing. But together, they suggested something the original investigation never acknowledged. The case might not have been understood at all. When the decision was made to submit the shoe for modern forensic testing, no one expected a miracle. Most cold case evidence yields nothing. Many efforts end quietly, with negative results and renewed frustration. Still, protocol demanded it. The evidence had been preserved. The technology existed. There was no longer an excuse not to look. As the shoe was packaged and sent to the lab, it carried more than leather and laces. It carried decades of assumptions. And the possibility that one of them was about to be undone. The results did not come back quickly. Modern testing is precise, but it is not fast. Investigators know better than to anticipate outcomes. Weeks passed. The months. The case remained open on the unit's internal board, one among many, its status unchanged except for a single note, evidence pending. When the call finally came from the lab, it was brief, controlled, professional. But it carried a weight everyone in the room felt immediately. There was not much, and not where anyone in 1963 would have thought to look. It wasn't on the exterior of the shoe, where hands might have touched it during collection. It was embedded deep within the lining, pressed into the leather where a thumb naturally rests while pulling a shoe off someone else's foot. Skin cells. Preserved by cold. Preserved by time. Waiting for a science that did not yet exist. The profile didn't belong to her. That single fact dismantled decades of certainty. The shoe was no longer neutral. No longer incidental. It was evidence of contact, intentional, physical, and close. Someone else had handled it in a way that mattered. Investigators returned to the scene with new eyes. Using digital terrain modeling, they reconstructed the landscape as it had existed that winter. Archived weather data provided temperature, wind speed, and snowfall patterns. Acoustic modeling estimated how sound would have carried through the trees. Witness statements were layered over the reconstruction, revealing where memory and reality diverged. That was when the gap appeared. Less than 20 minutes. A stretch of time no one could account for, during which her movement should have been visible from nearby homes. In 1963, that gap had been dismissed as error. People misremembered. Watches weren't precise. But with modern reconstruction, the gap became exact. Too exact to ignore. Photo enhancement revealed more. One image taken during the original search, long considered unusable, was stabilized and enlarged. At the edge of the frame, partially swallowed by shadow, sat a vehicle that had never been logged. Parked just far enough off the road to avoid notice. Positioned where the trees thickened. None of this proved guilt. But it proved something else. The disappearance had not been random. It had structure. Timing. Opportunity. When the DNA profile was run through national databases, there was no immediate match. That was expected. Whoever had left it had never been arrested, or at least, not for anything that required a DNA sample. Investigators turned to familial searching, a method unavailable for most of the case's existence. Instead of seeking a direct match, it searched for partial ones, connections that suggested family relationships rather than identities. A lead surfaced, then another. Slowly, an outline began to form, not from rumor or memory, but from data. From the overlooked detail that had waited in a box for 60 years. The shoe, once dismissed as meaningless, had become the key. And what it pointed toward was far more disturbing than an accident. The truth had been visible all along. Hidden not by time, but by trust. The name did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually, through records, cross-checks, and patterns that became harder to deny with each step. The familial DNA search did not deliver a suspect, it delivered a direction. A family line rooted in the same county. Present in the area in 1963. And tied, unexpectedly, to the investigation itself. At first, investigators assumed coincidence. In small towns, overlap is inevitable. People know each other. Families interlock across generations. But as the data tightened, coincidence became explanation. And explanation began to look like something else entirely. The partial DNA match did not arrive as an answer. It arrived as a complication. At first, it looked almost insignificant, just a percentage, a technical relationship that suggested proximity rather than identity. But when investigators followed the thread back through records and family trees, the direction became impossible to ignore. The match pointed not to a stranger, not to a transient figure who had passed briefly through town, but to a male relative of someone already documented in the original file. And not documented casually. This person had not appeared as a witness, had never been questioned as a suspect, had never been listed as someone of interest at all. Instead, their name appeared in a far more authoritative context, attached to reports, decisions, and movements that shaped the case from its earliest hours. An authority figure. Someone who had been on scene early. Someone whose presence had quietly defined the flow of information from the very beginning. Someone whose actions were recorded not as behavior to be scrutinized, but as procedure to be trusted. Most disturbing of all, someone whose movements that day had never been questioned, because no one had believed they needed to be. The realization forced a pause. Cold case investigators are trained to manage emotional distance. They deal in evidence, not implications. But this discovery disrupted that discipline. The room went quiet as the weight of it settled in. If the direction the evidence was pointing was correct, then this was no longer just a failure to solve a crime. It was a failure to look. The original reports were pulled again, this time stripped of their assumed authority. Investigators reread every page with a different lens, one sharpened by hindsight and unburdened by deference. Decisions that had once seemed routine now felt deliberate. Not overtly malicious. Not obviously corrupt. But carefully aligned. The early declaration of no foul play stood out immediately. It had come quickly, before timelines were fully established, before evidence was thoroughly evaluated. That declaration had done more than reassure the public. It had defined the scope of the investigation itself. The search area had been narrowed soon after, not based on new evidence, but on assumption. The absence of visible violence had been treated as proof of absence, rather than an invitation to look deeper. Leads that extended beyond that narrowed perimeter had been noted, then quietly dismissed. And then there was the shoe. The lack of follow-up on its condition now felt impossible to justify. A single shoe, neatly placed, undamaged, should have raised alarms. Instead, it had been neutralized through interpretation. Labeled incidental. Logged, then mentally discarded. Each action, taken on its own, could be explained. Even defended. But together, they formed a pattern. A pattern of control. Personnel records were requested next. Old duty logs. Shift assignments. Travel authorizations. Documents that rarely attract attention unless something has already gone wrong. These records told a story that had never been told in the investigation itself. A new timeline was constructed, not around the victim, around the authority figure whose DNA now hovered at the edges of the case. Investigators mapped their movements hour by hour, comparing official logs to witness statements, to reconstructed timelines based on weather and visibility. The result was unsettling. There was an unaccounted window of time, brief, but significant, that aligned almost perfectly with the gap identified during the modern reconstruction of the disappearance. Less than 20 minutes. Enough time. The overlap was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Next came the interviews. Statements taken in 1963 were compared against remarks made years later during casual conversations, retirement interviews, and historical recollections. The differences were subtle. A time adjusted slightly. A location softened. A detail omitted rather than contradicted. Always drifting in the same direction. Away from scrutiny. No single inconsistency proved deception. Memory degrades naturally. Stories change. But patterns matter. And here, the pattern was unmistakable. The narrative had not simply faded, it had been guided. For the investigators, the emotional weight of this realization was immense. This wasn't just about solving a crime that had lingered too long. It was about confronting the possibility that the very system meant to protect the community had shielded someone from suspicion. That trust, the foundational currency of small-town justice, had not merely failed. It had been used. That distinction mattered. Before moving forward, the unit consulted state authorities. The implications were too serious to handle quietly, too destabilizing to manage alone. If the evidence held, this would not only reopen a case, it would reopen history itself. It would force a public reckoning. Not just with what happened to one woman, but with how power, trust, and silence can converge to bury truth in plain sight. Additional DNA testing was authorized. This time, from living relatives connected to the family line identified through familial searching. Subpoenas followed. Carefully worded. Narrowly scoped. Designed to confirm without alarming. What had begun as a routine cold case review now carried the momentum of something far larger. Something that could not be contained once spoken aloud. Inside the investigation, the belief that the disappearance had been a tragic but harmless mystery had already collapsed. The facts no longer supported ambiguity. The case was no longer about uncertainty. It was about betrayal. But outside those walls, the town remained unchanged. People still spoke of the disappearance with detached sadness, with resignation, with a quiet certainty that some questions simply don't have answers. They did not yet know that the foundation of that certainty was about to crack. The overlooked detail, the shoe. The DNA embedded where no one had looked. The timeline gap dismissed decades earlier. Together, they pointed to a truth no one had wanted to imagine. And once that truth was seen, it could not be unseen. Because it suggested that the disappearance had not been forgotten by chance. It had been protected. And the closer investigators came to confirming that reality, the more inevitable the reckoning became, not just for one person, but for an entire system that had confused trust with truth for far too long. The question was no longer what happened. That question had finally been answered. What remained, what now pressed hardest against the edges of the investigation, was something far more unsettling: how long the truth had been buried, and who had helped keep it there. For decades, the disappearance had existed as an unresolved tragedy, softened by time and repetition. It had become something people spoke about with lowered voices and vague language, a story without edges. But the evidence no longer allowed for softness. It demanded clarity. And clarity, once reached, could not be returned to silence. The announcement did not arrive with sirens or dramatic press conferences. It came quietly, through a formal press release sent to local outlets early one morning. The language was careful, restrained, almost understated. Maine 1963 cold case solved, arrest shocks community. Just words. But behind them lay 60 years of absence, oversight, and unspoken compromise. Inside the courthouse, the gravity of the moment was almost tangible. Reporters who had never known the victim personally, some not even born when she disappeared, found themselves unsettled by the story's reach. This was not merely a crime resurfacing. It was the past asserting itself, demanding acknowledgement after decades of neglect. The arrest itself was executed with deliberate restraint. Officers moved without spectacle, aware that every action would be scrutinized, that any error could reverberate backward through time, threatening to unravel years of careful reconstruction. This was not a moment for performance. It was a moment for precision. The suspect, now elderly, was taken into custody quietly. The years had altered his appearance, but not the weight of what the evidence now suggested. For the first time, the authority that had once protected him offered no shelter. The systems that had deferred to his word now stood apart, bound by facts that could no longer be managed or dismissed. For the town, the shock was immediate and disorienting. The person whose voice had once carried reassurance, whose presence had shaped the earliest understanding of the disappearance, was now recast in a devastating new light. Trust, long assumed to be well-placed, collapsed under the weight of revelation. News spread quickly. Headlines repeated the same words, each one emphasizing the rupture. Maine. 1963. Cold case. Community. The story moved across screens and pages, becoming both historical and urgent at once. Those who remembered the original disappearance felt a familiar unease return, sharper now, stripped of its old ambiguity. Questions long suppressed resurfaced with force. Why had this been missed? How could someone so trusted be implicated? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could anyone else have known? Inside the courthouse, the machinery of justice resumed its work with methodical care. The arrest gave way to formal booking, photographs, and the quiet rituals of procedure. Evidence from the original investigation, the scarf, the shoe, the logs preserved out of habit rather than hope, was brought forward once again. For decades, these objects had existed without voice, their significance diminished by early conclusions. Now they spoke clearly, not through emotion but through context, through placement, through what had been overlooked. The shoe, once dismissed as incidental, now anchored the case. The scarf, preserved but unexplained, framed the final moments of the victim's routine. The logs, once treated as administrative records, revealed decisions that had guided the investigation away from uncomfortable truths. The community reacted in waves. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief hardened into anger. Conversations filled kitchens, diners, church halls, places where trust had once been assumed rather than examined. People revisited memories of ordinary days and familiar roads, wondering what they had failed to see. The betrayal felt personal, even to those separated by time. For investigators, the arrest was not simply a professional achievement. It was the culmination of persistence and humility, of recognizing that earlier certainty had been misplaced, that old assumptions had been allowed to stand unchallenged for far too long. Technology had made the breakthrough possible, but it was attention to overlooked details that had made it inevitable. Justice, delayed though it was, had not disappeared. For the victim's family, the arrest carried a weight that defied easy description. Relief arrived first, a validation of what they had never been able to prove, but had never stopped believing. But relief was quickly entangled with grief. Decades of time had been stolen. Trust had been weaponized against them. And the person they had once believed would help bring answers had, instead, helped conceal them. The arrest marked the end of one chapter, but not the conclusion of the story. The cold case was no longer cold. The shoe, the scarf, the overlooked details, they were no longer silent witnesses. They had become testimony. When the trial began, the courtroom carried a stillness that felt almost reverent. Journalists, investigators, and members of the community filled the benches, some with notebooks open, others with cameras lowered out of respect. Everyone understood that this was not just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. Time felt distorted. The trial unfolded in the present, but its roots stretched deep into the past. For the victim's family, sitting together in the front row, the experience was surreal. They held hands as attorneys laid out the evidence piece by piece, listening as the last moments of their loved one's life were reconstructed with care and precision. The scarf was displayed. The shoe followed. Objects once dismissed were now central, each one carrying a story that had been waiting decades to be told. Every detail mattered. Every omission from the original investigation became visible under modern scrutiny. The prosecution's case was built not on speculation, but on convergence. DNA evidence, impossible in 1963, was now definitive. Enhanced photographs revealed what earlier eyes could not see. Reconstructed timelines closed gaps once explained away by faulty memory. Together, they formed a narrative that left little room for doubt. The defense challenged the passage of time, questioned memories worn thin by decades. But time, once an obstacle, had become an ally to the truth. The evidence no longer relied on recollection alone. It rested on science, on documentation, on patterns that had survived long after human memory had faded. As witnesses testified, the emotional gravity of delayed justice became unmistakable. Some spoke haltingly, their voices shaped by age and restraint. Others recalled small moments, details dismissed at the time, that now took on new meaning. Each testimony reinforced the same conclusion: the disappearance had not been accidental, and authority had been used, subtly but effectively, to shield the truth. The courtroom became a bridge between eras. On one side stood ignorance, silence, and misplaced trust. On the other stood accountability, exposure, and acknowledgement. The process was slow, deliberate, and at times painful, but it was no longer avoidable. When the verdict was finally rendered, it arrived without spectacle. Solemn, definitive. It carried the weight of decades, of a life interrupted, of a family forced to wait, of a community misled. The delay had been cruel, but the acknowledgement mattered. It affirmed what had long been denied, that injustice had occurred, that it had been permitted to persist, and that accountability, however late, still mattered. For the family, the verdict did not erase loss. Nothing could. But it restored something that had been missing for far too long: their loved one's voice. Her disappearance was no longer an unresolved footnote. It was recognized as a crime, and her story reclaimed its truth. For the community, the reckoning was ongoing. Trust, once assumed, now demanded examination. The case became a reminder that authority must be questioned, that certainty should never replace scrutiny, and that silence can be as powerful as action in shaping outcomes. And for the evidence, the shoe, the scarf, the fragments preserved through decades of neglect, they had fulfilled their purpose at last. They had endured long enough to be heard. The truth had not been lost to time. It had been waiting for a moment when technology, persistence, and courage finally aligned, when someone was willing to look again and ask not just what happened, but why it had taken so long to face it. And in that reckoning, justice, long deferred, was finally recognized. For the family, there was no undoing the years they had lost. No verdict, no sentence, no formal acknowledgement could return the birthdays that passed without her, the holidays that felt permanently altered, or the ordinary moments that had been quietly erased by absence. Time had taken what it always takes, irreplaceable pieces of life, and nothing in the courtroom could reverse that. But there was relief. Not the kind that closes wounds, but the kind that allows them to finally breathe. There was relief in the recognition, in the public acknowledgement that their loved one's life, and her disappearance, had mattered. That she had not simply faded into history as an unresolved mystery or a footnote in a filing cabinet. The truth, once buried beneath silence and misplaced trust, had finally been given its rightful place. For the family, the courtroom became something more than a space of judgment. It became a place of restoration, a place where decades of neglect and betrayal were finally confronted, where the narrative that had followed them for most of their lives was rewritten, not with speculation or assumption, but with fact. They listened as the final words were spoken, not just by the court, but by history itself. Words that affirmed what they had carried quietly for so long: that their waiting had not been foolish, that their questions had been valid, that their grief had been justified. Justice had arrived late. But it had arrived. The town, too, was forced into reflection. For generations, the disappearance had existed as a softened memory, shaped by repetition and reassurance. It had been easier to believe in accident, easier to trust early conclusions, easier to accept that some things simply could not be known. That belief had been comfortable, familiar. Now it was gone. The person once trusted, once unquestioned, had been exposed. Not as a distant villain, but as someone woven deeply into the fabric of the community. That proximity made the reckoning more difficult and more necessary. Community narratives shifted. People revisited old conversations, old assumptions, old moments of certainty that now felt fragile. They spoke about trust, how easily it can be granted, how rarely it is examined, and how dangerous it can become when paired with authority and silence. The case became more than a solved crime. It became a lesson, a reminder that justice is not self-executing, that systems are only as honest as the people who question them, that assumptions, once accepted, can become barriers to truth rather than pathways toward it. For some, the realization brought anger. For others, shame. For many, a quiet sense of responsibility to remember differently, to listen more carefully, to resist the comfort of easy conclusions. And through it all, the story of the missing woman, once silent, once obscured by negligence, was finally spoken aloud. Her voice, carried through preserved evidence, reconstructed timelines, and the courage to look again, reached the ears of those who had waited for decades. It demanded recognition, reflection, and an acknowledgement that some wrongs, no matter how old, still require confrontation. She was no longer defined by her disappearance. She was defined by her truth. Outside the courthouse, life resumed slowly. There were no dramatic changes to the landscape, no visible markers to signal what had shifted beneath the surface. But something had changed nonetheless. The road remained the same. The pines still lined either side, standing as silent sentinels over the stretch of asphalt where footprints had once disappeared into snow. Winter returned as it always had, pale and sharp, tracing familiar paths through the town. But now the light seemed different. Not brighter, not warmer, more honest. It illuminated not just the trees and the road, but the history beneath them. A landscape that had once felt neutral now carried weight, memory layered upon memory, truth resting where assumption once stood. People drove that road as they always had. Some without thought. Others with a pause, a glance, a quiet awareness of what had once unfolded there. The place had not changed, but its meaning had. And perhaps that was the final truth of the case. That justice does not always transform the world outwardly. Sometimes, it works inward, reshaping understanding, altering memory, and restoring dignity where it was long denied. The evidence had waited. The truth had endured. And when the moment finally came, when technology, persistence, and courage aligned, the story found its ending not in spectacle, but in acknowledgement. A life recognized. A betrayal exposed. A silence broken. The case was closed. But its lesson remained. That time does not erase truth. That trust must never replace scrutiny. And that even after decades of waiting, justice, when finally pursued, still matters. The road stretched on, unchanged in form, forever altered in meaning. And in that quiet persistence, the truth finally rested where it belonged. For the family, closure did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, in the way grief often does when it finally loosens its grip, not by disappearing, but by changing shape. After the verdicts, after the cameras moved on, after the courtroom emptied and the words "case closed" became official, they returned once more to the place where everything had stopped. They had come here many times before. In winter, when snow erased the ground and made memory sharper. In summer, when the road looked deceptively ordinary. Each visit had carried the same unanswered questions, the same suspended moment. But this time was different. This time, the silence did not accuse them. It did not ask them to imagine what might have happened. It told them what had. The ground was clear now, the snow long gone, but in their minds it was still winter. They could see her as she had been that morning, walking steadily, her breath visible in the cold air, boots pressing into ice that no longer existed. They could hear the sound that had followed her for years, the crunch of footsteps that once ended without explanation. For decades, those memories had been incomplete. Fragments without resolution. but now they aligned. The details that had haunted them, the neatness of the shoe, the absence of footprints beyond a certain point, the way the scarf had been placed, were no longer anomalies. They were evidence. They spoke clearly now, no longer muted by assumption or neglect. They spoke of intent, of betrayal, of a moment when trust had been exploited and silence enforced. And ultimately, they spoke of revelation. The overlooked evidence had endured. It had survived not because anyone believed in it, but because procedure demanded it be kept. Because someone long ago had sealed a box instead of discarding its contents. Because objects, unlike people, do not forget. The shoe had waited. The scarf had waited. The DNA, invisible and unknown, had waited for a science that did not yet exist, for a time when persistence would outweigh convenience, when questions would be asked not out of obligation, but out of conviction. In the end, it was not luck that solved the case. It was patience. And that patience restored more than facts. It restored voice. Her voice. For years, the story of her disappearance had been told by others, by reports, by conclusions drawn too quickly, by narratives shaped around comfort rather than truth. She had existed as an absence, defined by what was missing. Now she was present again. Her story, reconstructed through evidence and care, reclaimed its place. She was no longer the subject of speculation. She was a person whose life mattered, whose final moments had meaning, whose disappearance demanded accountability. And with that restoration came a reckoning. Not just for the individual who had abused trust and authority, but for the systems that had allowed silence to substitute for scrutiny. For the decisions made early, when certainty had been declared before understanding was complete. For the collective memory that had preferred an easy explanation to an uncomfortable truth. Justice, though delayed, was now tangible. The person responsible had been confronted, exposed, and held accountable. Removed from the position of trust they had occupied for decades. Their authority, once unquestioned, had been stripped of its protection. The courtroom and the verdicts that followed sent ripples far beyond the case itself. They reminded everyone who watched that authority is not infallible. That trust, when unexamined, can become dangerous. And that silence, especially institutional silence, can be as damaging as any act of violence. Yet alongside that reckoning came relief. Not triumph. Not celebration. Relief. The scales, long tilted by time and neglect, had finally shifted. Not perfectly. Not without cost. But enough. For the town, the story would endure. It would be told again and again, not as rumor or half-remembered tragedy, but as history. As a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Children would hear it not as a mystery softened by time, but as a lesson, one that revealed how ordinary days can conceal extraordinary truths, and how justice, though slow, matters more than expedience. They would learn that conclusions should be questioned. That silence should never be mistaken for resolution. And that truth does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. The town would remember differently now. And for the family, closure was not legal alone. It was emotional, restorative, and, in its own way, hauntingly beautiful. They could return to memory without being consumed by its gaps. They could acknowledge the depth of betrayal without being trapped inside it. They could speak her name without the weight of uncertainty pressing against it. They could remember her not only as the victim of a crime long hidden, but as who she had been before all of it. Alive. Ordinary. No. The road remained. Unchanged in shape, yet forever transformed in meaning. Cars passed over it every day, tires humming against asphalt that held no visible trace of what had occurred there decades earlier. Snow would fall again. Leaves would turn. Winters would arrive, pale and sharp, just as they always had. The pines would stand as they always had. But beneath them, the story was complete. Silent objects had spoken. Overlooked details had aligned. Decades of memory had finally found resolution. A life had been restored to history. A voice had been returned to truth. And after all those years of waiting, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was a peace.